clouds. Planes couldn't land at Burbank Airport. However windy it is here, double or triple that down there in Los Angeles area. This is an informational hearing. I'd like to thank Senator Wolk for attending. We're both very interested in the subject of water, and today we're focusing on chronically underfunded water needs. I thought I would keep my comments to a very minimum because I want to hear from the speakers and because I know you've been waiting patiently to begin, but I wanted to point out that this is sort of the fact-finding informational part of the hearing, and then this hearing will continue, we hope, in January or early February, looking at solutions. And so my goal is to come away today with trying to be a good listener and figuring out ways collectively what we can agree on, not what we can't agree on. What are some different ways to fund long-term needs that can't be met through traditional sources, especially with the challenges we have from Proposition 218 and Prop 26, and the list goes on. And even with bonds, I was surprised how little of our funding source really can come from bonds. We seem to have less and less coming from the federal governments, but maybe things will change. And locals then have a lot of pressure on them to meet needs, so particularly challenging with long-term investment strategies relating to disadvantaged communities and others. So with that, I can't think of a better person to kick this off than Ellen Hannock from PPIC. I read your briefing statement, and if you would come forward, please.
And Lester.
Oh, excuse me, we're going to start with Lester Snow and Ellen Hannock. Two.
Yeah. Two witnesses in one.
And while they're moving forward, I'll do just a real brief biography, because I assume this is being taped.
Yep. Yes.
Okay.
Broadcasted.
Oh, broadcasted. So Lester Snow directs the California Water Foundation and leads integrated resource management projects. I remember him mostly working with him when he was Secretary of Resources under the Schwarzenegger administration. I didn't know this, Lester, but you've been chair of the Ocean Protection Council, the Delta Conservancy, the Delta Protection Commission, and the Strategic Growth Council at some point in time. Okay, so you are a perfect person for this discussion. You wear many hats. Ellen, thank you very much for coming. It's been, this is the beginning of, will be the beginning of my 8th year as chair of the Senate Natural Resources and Water Committee, and we really value your research and background and opinions on issues relating to water policy. So you're with the PPIC Water Policy Center, and the number of publications you have written on managing California's water and those kinds of topics has been amazing, and we're very fortunate to have your expertise. So let's hear from both of you to outline an introduction of what are California's water needs and maybe how we pay for them. Lester, are you up first?
Great, yes, I'll go first, and then Ellen can fill in with the facts. First, Senator Pavley, Senator Wolk, I really want to thank you for your leadership on this extremely important and unfortunately timely topic. And unfortunately, because I just think there's a lot of things that we need to be doing that we're not doing. You have a great list of speakers with a lot of expertise about what's going on with funding, what's underfunded, and what's completely unfunded at this point. And certainly Ellen is at the top of that list. So I don't want to duplicate what others might say, but I do want to try to provide some context and some highlights. And my main message is that we are falling behind in our ability to fund essential water resource investments, especially related to public health and public health protection in terms of drinking water, but also on a broader topic of climate adaptation, including rebuilding ecosystem resilience and water supply reliability. In my opinion, our natural resource reality, including the hydrology, is changing faster than our policies and institutions are capable of adapting. And I think, unfortunately, this year provides a great illustration where we may have a continuation of a drought emergency declaration and potentially a flood declaration later from the newly named Godzilla El Nino, which you held a hearing on.
We had that hearing in
That's right.
LA. It was dubbed Godzilla.
So
El Niños.
I think that is just a manifestation of this changed world that we're in. We've had climate scientists for decades forecasting a loss of snowpack, which has been happening steadily for 30 years or more. They've also forecasted an increase in extremes, more frequent droughts and more severe droughts at the same time of having more severe storms and higher flood peaks. And again, we're seeing that likely this year. So kind of on the positive side, I think California water managers are adapting to that reality better than the rest of the country in terms of integrated water management, supply diversification, increased attention to a comprehensive approach that can include the environment. Even though we're still quite siloed in the water management world, there's much greater attention to the interaction between flood management, water supply, water quality, and ecosystem health. So while we're making progress in the need for climate adaptation, our funding mechanisms remain largely unchanged to an era that has gone by. Ellen will do a very good job of where the money comes from and how we're getting there. But rates and bonds have been go-to mechanisms, and rates the largest one. But even in the case of rates, in the last 20 years, we've had well-intended efforts in Prop 218 to improve accountability, but one of the results of that is it makes it more complicated to fund certain things. And we've created more red tape, greater expense in doing studies to see whether we need the money to do things, less flexibility. And I think we've effectively hobbled local government in terms of being less able to respond to these changing conditions and changing needs. We see this in a number of ways. I mean, just a couple of examples of that will be covered subsequently. But in the case of disadvantaged communities, the PUC actually requires investor-owned utilities to have a LIRA, low-income rate assistance program, as a matter of public policy. Prop 218 prohibits public agencies from having a lifeline rate. It's kind of nonsensical on its face. Flood and stormwater are different than water supply when you look at setting rates. And yet, stormwater can be a significant part of our water supply in the future. So we kind of have this, nothing analytical about what I'm about to say, but it's like you have to tie each molecule of water to each penny of benefit to someone. And I don't think that we can use a method like that to respond to the conditions that are in front of us. And on the issue of bonds, which are incredibly important, it's episodic investment. We passed one last year. When are we going to have the next one? Is it next year? I mean, there could be one next year, or is it 10 years from now? And then you have the extra problem that bonds are only good for capital. And you're left with the O&M for whatever the project is, whether it's habitat restoration, or as I'll mention again in a moment, improving safe drinking water for disadvantaged communities. So you have an example of a flood project or an urban stormwater project where if you do it right, you'll reduce flood damage, you'll pull off the flood peaks, you'll reduce water contamination from the project, you'll increase groundwater recharge and water supply, and you'll provide habitat. And we've gotten caught up in running a line back to each one of those things rather than looking at the efficiency of the investment. We have to change that. I want to hit some of the things your other speakers are going to cover in better detail, but I think they're important to pull out here. If I left here today and went to the San Joaquin Valley and did a quick film on drinking water systems in the San Joaquin Valleys, viewers of that film would assume it was shot in a third world country. That is completely unacceptable. I mean, I don't know how we tolerate that, and yet we probably wouldn't be talking about it were it not for the drought and the fact that wells have gone dry. There's not enough attention on is that those wells, before they went dry, were serving substandard water that didn't meet drinking water standards. And we have access to capital, fortunately, But if we build a system for some of these disadvantaged communities that can take out the arsenic and can take out the nitrates, they're going to have O&M costs that they can't afford. We need a revenue stream that will deal with those kinds of issues. On stormwater, I've kind of already mentioned this issue. And by the way, on drinking water, in the folder that's in front of you is just a few pieces of information about disadvantaged communities and drinking water, and also some data on stormwater in the other handout. I guess what I'd mention on stormwater is that it must be a significant part of future urban water supply. But is it a flood program? Is it a responsibility of the sanitation agency or public works, a water department? Is it a health issue because of the water quality issues? It's kind of in a rate-setting limbo. And I think we are falling behind in investing in stormwater management. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of acre-feet of water supply there for the taking. I mentioned another one that doesn't get much attention, and that's watershed health. We've seen news reports of 20 million dead trees this year. We certainly have seen massive wildfires. We've already seen mud flows. A healthy watershed or investing in a watershed will protect water supply, water quality, flood management, ecosystem health. They're all affected by watershed management. And yet it's very challenging to figure out how we're going to invest in a healthy watershed. The final issue I want to bring up is that this changing water world that we're in needs good data, and data quickly. It needs to be data that is accessible to a broad group of people, including the public, and it needs good science behind it. Our decision-making must keep up with the changing world around us. We must invest in data collection, accessibility, and the science that will allow us to quickly respond in a cost-effective manner. One issue that's kind of striking, in the last 3 decades, we've lost 2/3 of the USGS gauging stations. And this is at a time where we need to know more about flows and more about the water quality or the water temperature of those flows. We need them now. We can't afford to invest in yesterday's solutions to yesterday's problems. That requires a steady investment in data and in science to go with that. And having been in positions where I've suffered through budget cuts, the first thing to go is data collection. The second thing to go is the evaluation of data and the science that goes with that. We need some stable investment in that kind of system. And in closing, I just say, as we're pursuing strategies to reduce water supply and ecosystem volatility, we must develop strategies to bring stable revenue streams to these and other essential investments. Poll after poll shows the public very willing to invest in these kinds of programs. It's not an issue of the public, it's an issue of us developing the will to start identifying and addressing these unfunded and underfunded issues. As we shift from drought to flood, or in this year both, it highlights the interconnections and essential natures of all of these pieces that are going to be part of our sustainable water future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lester. Appreciate that. Let's go ahead and hear from Ellen, and then we'll open up.
Okay. Thanks very much for the invitation to speak. I have a handout that's sort of like a PowerPoint slides, which I also left some out for the audience. So I just thought this would be a useful way to run through results from some very in-depth work that we did that came out in the spring of 2014, and then we did some follow-up work that came out earlier this year that you also have a short policy brief on. Just highlight kind of some things that are useful to think about given where we stand now and the progress that has been made also. No need to remind, Lester did a great job of that, of the really critical importance of our water system, and I think that the drought is providing a lot of lessons for us on how to get better, and funding is definitely one of them. So slide 3 just is, I think, Senator, maybe when you gave your opening remarks, we're kind of alluding to this picture. This is what we spend annually on our water system, looking across the broad range of things, and this does not include the upper watershed forest management issues that Lester raised, and that are really, I think a very appropriate thing to think about as partly a water issue, but also just a broader environmental management issue as well. So this is, looking across water supply, water quality here. This is mostly wastewater treatment and wastewater treatment systems. It's a little bit for stormwater, maybe about $500 million to maybe 800 million. Flood management, you can see, is much smaller, just a couple billion, dollars a year. Aquatic ecosystems, that budget is for what the fisheries and wildlife agencies do at the federal and state level directly. It doesn't reflect the fact that some of the projects under water supply, under floods, and under water quality also take into account environmental investments. And then just for good measure, we put in there the GO bond debt service, just to remind us that bonds are not free. We got to pay them back. So a key piece of this, in addition to seeing who are the gorillas in the room and who are not, in terms of size of the sector, is, as you mentioned, Senator, the federal government being a pretty small player. We expect that probably this is lower now, actually, because this period that we looked at included the funding from the stimulus bill. Which was a kind of one-time boost that was very helpful in a lot of different water areas. The state, depending on the year, 10 to 12% or so. So locals really are the story. And then just kind of moving in a little bit to looking at kind of an overview of what we found in terms of how spending compares with estimates of needs. Looking first at urban water and wastewater utilities, that's slide 4. This is comparing bars both for urban wastewater and for urban water supply, what the capital needs estimates are, and this is drawing on surveys that are done at the local level every 4 years or so by the US EPA. So this is contributed by local agencies in terms of their capital spending plans. And the EPA does a 20-year estimate, so this is just taking 1/20th of a slice, and it's comparing it to recent capital spending levels. And what you can see in both cases is that capital spending has been higher than that, and that does not mean that there's too much spending by any stretch of the imagination, because these needs estimates probably miss some things. They don't always account for needs related to growth, and they may not account for all of the kinds of seismic upgrades that need to be done and so on. But I and my team, we interpret this more as saying that we're not, on average, in a very great mismatch with spending being way below needs. So the reason that this is the case is, our sense is that because so far rates have been able to be largely been able to be raised when they need, when you make a case to your public, you can raise rates for capital projects, and we can see all around the state cases where that's been true. We can also see with this drought that investments in cities and in suburban water agencies have really made our cities and suburbs more drought resilient. And just look at the increases in storage in urban Southern California, the interconnections, just a lot of work that's gone into making this happen. It's important for us to maintain the momentum on that, and that's where the looming concerns come in. And I think that's both that costs are rising, and as treatment standards go up, and we're constantly looking for ways to improve that, costs go up. Infrastructure is aging. In some places, still needs to be fixed and maintained, and then we're seeing more and more of uncertainty about the ability to raise rates with Prop 218. And I think now with the drought and the loss in revenues, that's a sort of a new and very urgent concern. And as Lester mentioned, lifeline rates are becoming a bigger issue now because of rising costs. Sort of making sure to take care of, we have the problem of safe drinking water in rural communities and small rural communities. Those are small systems that can't afford for their own. A lot of California's disadvantaged populations are living in places that have pretty good urban systems, but if we're not able to provide lifeline rates to them, we're also not dealing with an important social equity issue. So moving on to just sort of the overview of our kind of scorecard of funding gaps, what we've dubbed fiscal orphans. This is slide 5. The key gaps are not in water supply and wastewater. from our perspective, they really are, in places where we're really failing systematically, are in safe drinking water in small rural systems, in flood protection, in stormwater management, in aquatic ecosystem management, and then integrated water management, which Lester talked about as a really essential way for moving forward. We're saying that's on the brink, and that's because those are ideally projects where you're pulling together various different players, and some of them, in the current circumstances, are just very weak partners because they can't bring money to the table. So if you want to do a stormwater project, and there's a piece of the cost that's a water quality aspect, the Water Supply Agency can't really take that on. And they legally don't really have the flexibility to do that. So you need to make it more straightforward for folks to raise the funding also for the regulatory mandates there. Slide 6 summarizes for you the constitutional environment that has really made it tough, and really, I think, in large part defines why we have these fiscal orphans. And you know, these were all measures that were passed with very good intentions in terms of accountability and in terms of wanting more transparency in the system, but they have definitely made it harder for locals to raise funding. I've highlighted in red just a few pieces here that are especially important for local funding. So Prop 13 in 1978, by creating a category called special taxes, local special taxes, saying that they required a 2/3 vote, is a much higher hurdle than a 50% vote. Prop 218, which is really the big one, it made general taxes no longer available to special districts. So special districts, if they're going to get go for taxes, have to go for a 2/3 vote. And then it created a lot of requirements around local property-related taxes, which we now understand to be pretty much anything related to water. So the very, I think, good accountability part of it is requiring transparent notification of fee changes and property owner protest hearings to be able to overturn those or provide input. But then the tougher ones are the strict cost of service requirements, and that kind of gets to Lester's point about, you know, what we've called molecular accounting, or, you know, each drop being linked to each penny, makes it very hard to do modern water management. And then for floods and stormwater, an added requirement that in addition to passing the property owner protest hearing, you have to actually go and actually affirmatively get people to vote. And that's just a higher hurdle as well. Prop 26 added some additional requirements that make it hard for stormwater funding, in particular with regulatory fees, and also make it harder at the wholesale water utility level to raise fees. So, Senator, you mentioned about the role of general obligation bonds, and they have definitely been a boost, no question about it. And I think they've helped push the state's kind of the state's leadership in nudging local agencies to go toward more modern integrated water management. They've also helped to fill some gaps with fiscal orphans over the past, well, really since the early 2000s. And you can see on slide 7 just the very large increase in state bond funding that became available for the water sector kind of writ large, including also parks in this case. The amount is much less so far now in the 2010s. I've marked there the potential ballot measure that voters may see in November of next year. But, you know, all told, what we're looking at here is about $1 billion a year that goes to the water sector. And if you remember, we're talking about 30 plus total. So it's important at the margin. Do not want to diminish that, but it's not enough to fill all of the gaps, which we estimated are about $2 to $3 billion a year. And that's, again, not counting forest management. So we've also reached the point where what we're paying back in GO bond debt reimbursement is bigger than what we're getting out at this point. So now looking at, just very quickly, slide 9 shows you a pie chart with what Prop 1 does. And a large part of that is focused on water supply, but then also some of these fiscal orphans, ecosystems, drinking water quality, integrated management, and so on. I'll just also point out that the water supply piece there does include some funding for storage that directly has to benefit ecosystems. And you can see how that breaks out, how the bond breaks out in slide 10 relative to our fiscal orphans. That's a table that compares for you those 5 fiscal orphan areas, what we estimate as the annual spending gap, and then what a one-time infusion of Prop 1 is providing there. And, you know, the Prop 1 definitely provides some funding in all of these areas, but you can see that pretty quickly you're going to, for one, it's not going to map directly one-for-one into all the needs, because the bond language was written in ways that, you know, directed to certain things and not others. But very quickly, we're going to be at a point where we're not going to be able to rely on Prop 1 as a way of filling gaps. And as Lester pointed out, for some of these things, like in safe drinking water for small rural communities, you can get capital, but you can't get the O&M. So we've listed here just another of a list of longer-term funding options that include combinations of fees and special taxes. And in the detailed work we've done, we point out there are a lot of different examples already in California, especially at the local level, where we do use some of these kinds of tools, and even at the state level in other sectors, like in transportation. So we shouldn't feel like those things should be off the table, I guess. We do have good models for them, and we just have to think about how to broaden them. And then just to my last slide, to sort of wrap up, I think that we've seen some really important progress, and the legislature has taken some important actions to help address some of these gaps. Over the last couple of years, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act made major strides in increasing the authorities of the local sustainability agencies to charge, assess fees in order to manage groundwater basins, and that can do things like pay for recharge with recycled water, stormwater, other things. I think, you know, also AB 2403, which broadened the definition of water supply to try to get at this issue that Lester raised of difficulty sort of, you know, who's in charge of paying for stormwater. At least that makes it clear that a water supply agency can be justified in thinking that way of the water supply components. I think that the consolidation of small systems with other systems that was passed and enacted this year is an important step toward helping on safe drinking water in rural communities. And so I'm just listing, in conclusion, a few other actions that could help. One of them, I've given testimony about this before, and I don't think it's happened yet, so I'm going to say it again. I think broadening local agency missions can be really useful. So thinking about integrated management, and there, the model I have in mind is back in 2001, legislation that gave the Urban Ranch Water District and the Santa Margarita Water District, which are both urban water suppliers, authority to manage urban runoff that was related to basically what's sometimes affectionately called urban slobber. You know, the excess watering in the drier months that has a very clear nexus with the water supply function, so they can then use some of their revenues in order to help manage that problem. So it's a nice example of integrated management in a close nexus. I think that would make sense to extend just blanket across the state as a potential authority. I think the legislature has a role in approving new fees and taxes to help in this, and I know that's a hard lift, but
It's like a JPA.
well, or just, you know, think about, in some cases, regulatory fees, our analysis, I mean, we feel that if it's for ongoing sources of pollution, for example, that's still a 50% vote in the legislature under Prop 226. So for certain kinds of pollutants, it could make sense for the legislature to do that. And, you know, as well as thinking about cases where you want to control pollution at the source. And then finally, I mean, we know one of our conclusions was that probably some of this is going to require some constitutional cleanup language in relation to some of the unintended constraints that came up with Prop 218 and 26. So, you know, that probably relates to the definition of water, thinking about incorporating lifeline rates, and that's something that will have to go to the voters, but the legislature can play a role there in sending that to the voters. So, thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Senator Wolf, did you have some questions or comments?